All you.
All right, so hi everyone. I'm Aaron Felady. I run a small Drupal consultancy just over the border in Indiana. I do a lot of Drupal projects. Lately, we're starting to branch out into doing Gatsby type things as well. I am here to talk about Lando today. Probably put my slides up here. I've been working a lot with Lando since before it was Lando. It used to be called Calabox. Some of the guys who worked at a company called Calamuna built this thing, and it was super cool. It gave me a much simpler way to install environments on my machine to replicate them, and not have to do a full config of like a virtual machine. Now let's see. Screen share working again. Have too many things open. I lost it. Share screen. All right. It appears that I'm sharing. Slides up. So this presentation is a work in progress. So I will talk about what I do have in slides, and when the slides run out, I will talk about everything else with code on the screen. So this is Deploy to Mars with Lando. I already introduced myself. So what is Lando? Lando, I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with it at this point. If not, maybe you're familiar with things like ddev local or doxel. Those are very similar tools, similar systems, work in similar ways. But the gist of it is you can mimic your production environment locally. All your versions of everything, PHP, Apache, MySQL. Spin up a local environment. Everything's defined. It makes that really easy. You can standardize your environments across like Windows, Linux, Mac OS, and everybody's essentially running the same system. So that eliminates the problem of, okay, that worked on my machine, because everyone's system is essentially going to be the same. It integrates with hosting providers like Pantheon and coming soon Platform SH and Amazy. They essentially give you tools built in to deploy your code, pull down the latest copy of your database right into your local. It makes it super easy. You just execute a command and it'll just do it. You can customize and extend your tooling and deployment processes. You can define commands that are common. If you've got a long command that you might put into Drush to do certain things, you can make that, if it's a common command, it has a bunch of flags, a bunch of variables you have to put in. You can make that a single command. Just type Lando, download database, and it'll run everything to do that. And you can find that, and then everyone who is on your team can get those options. You can run CI tests locally and local tests in CI. So if you've got automated testing, if you're running any sort of linting, anything like that, you can make Lando commands through the tooling that just give you that functionality. You enter one command, and it runs your whole testing process, but it also gives you the ability to run the tests in CI. So you can, if you've got these local tests running in Lando, there's a Lando script called Hyperdrive that you can put into your CI process, GitHub Actions or any other CI tooling, you can essentially, when you define your environment in that service, you use this Hyperdrive script, and it builds Lando, installs Lando essentially on their servers, and you can have it execute commands. If you've got your testing commands in Lando, it spins up a copy of Lando, runs the command just like you're doing it on your local machine, and you can make sure you're using the same process as what you're testing locally in your CI, and makes it more consistent. And it gives you the ability to use a local development environment for all of your projects. So because it uses Docker as its underlying system, Docker kind of lets you separate and containerize things so that you can have a bunch of different environments defined, and they all can run essentially on the same virtual machine. And so depending on which project you're working on, you need different versions of this or that running, rather than having to switch things out on your machine. You just spin up the pieces you need inside Docker, and Lando just does that for you, and you get what you need. So my slides kind of dive right into the more in-depth part of this, but we can start there. So one of the concepts I wanted to talk about was using Drupal as an app. Now, when I say Drupal as an app, I mean you can download it onto your local machine and you can run it, and it doesn't exist on a server anywhere. So how could that be useful? You use something like the Tome module, for example. The Tome module it turns Drupal into a static site generator. So you get flat HTML output from your Drupal site. So you get Drupal. So we're running Drupal locally with Lando. And with Tome, you generate HTML, and you can just publish your HTML. And it also stores all of your content as static JSON. So you can commit all of your content to like GitHub, or wherever you store your code. So all of your content, all of your config exists as flat files that you can download. And Lando allows you to have your entire environment defined in a single file. So you get everything you need to start your Drupal installation, start adding content, and generating HTML that you can put on any basic server anywhere, and you can publish it. We'll talk a little bit about how that works. So yeah, with Tome, it's you just have standard Drupal. You go to your code. If you're using GitHub, Lando makes that super easy. You can do there's Lando init command that allows you to point. You say Lando init in your command line. It asks you where's your code. You say okay, it's on GitHub. You put in your repository, and Lando will actually pull down. It'll clone all the code, and if you're using Tome, it'll pull down all your content, all your config, your definition of Lando, and then you type Lando start, and it builds everything you need, and you end up with a standard working Drupal interface. And so, but now this is just on your local machine, right? So you enter it. What Tome does, it's smart. It will monitor that new content was created, and it outputs JSON files, like I said, to do configuring content. So as soon as you save and publish that piece of content, it immediately creates a JSON file with all your content inside of it. And then in our example, I'll show you in a minute here, you can just type single command Lando build. Lando build actually will execute a drush command that comes with the Tome module that kicks off the generation of the HTML. And then you end up with a folder in your Drupal directory called HTML. And inside of it will be the static HTML assets You can just take that whole HTML file and publish it, and it is a fully functioning website. Tome uses your theme and everything. Whatever your Drupal would look like without Tome when it generates this flat HTML, looks just the same. So we're going to talk about what that configuration looks like to allow you to do these things. So your basic Lando configuration file, the Lando YAML, you define things about your environment. This first section of the file, we're naming our project example Tome. Lando comes with recipes that allow you to define a commonly used set of defaults, sane defaults to run whatever you choose. In this, I chose their built-in Drupal 8 recipe. Currently, Tome is not compatible with Drupal 9, at least not a few days ago when I looked. So we're using Drupal 8 in this example. And so Lando knows that, okay, which versions of PHP, Apache, MySQL make the most sense for Drupal 8. It installs all those for you. And that's all the config you need to do to get that part working. In our example, I'm saying that I've got a directory called Drupal, and inside that, directory called web. And that tells Lando that that's our web root. So when we're running locally, we get, it gives us, it hits the index PHP that's in that directory and runs it. Also in our Lando YAML, we have our services definition. So services are, when you use the Drupal 8 recipe, it, like I said, puts the same defaults in there. It creates an app server service, which will have, I believe, PHP 7.3, as I said, the right versions of the various systems that need to be running for Drupal to work. So actually, App Server is just our Apache and PHP. So what I'm doing here is I want to add some functionality to App Server. I'm saying that during the build step, when Lando's actually has downloaded the service, built the container, started running it, you can add some commands in there, things that you want it to run. In my case, I want it to run, I want it to change into the Drupal directory and run Composer install. So that runs Composer and gets all of your dependencies. So this will just happen automatically. So as part of your process, when like I said earlier, you run Lando in it, it downloads all your code, and then you run Lando start. The first time you do that, this build process runs, and it'll automatically then download all your dependencies with Composer. And then we're also doing some overrides to the configuration of the app server. In this case, Lando gives you some environment variables by default within the system. And what I've done here is just added another. This is the Drush options URI environment variable, and what that does is allows Drush to know what URL is used to access the site in this current environment. So by default, if you don't set this, Drush will just use default. It'll be http://default and then whatever URL. And that only affects Drush. So if you're doing like Drush user login to log into your site, you actually get the full path this way. So tooling is, as I mentioned earlier, the commands that you can define yourself. In this example, I have an install command that is there to install Drupal's dependencies. So Drupal gets the dependencies installed when you first build the container, but let's say you need to update that, you need to get the latest version on your computer. You've already built it once, but it's changed since you've got out your laptop and changed it, or someone else is working on things too, and they've committed some changes to the dependencies. So you just pull in with Git the latest definition, you put the latest code, and you run now just Lando install, and it'll automatically update everything for you. So in this, we've defined our service as app server, so inside that PHP container, and the commands it's going to run. The first one there, it's just the little status message and all that stuff around it is to make it look blue in the output. And then we're changing into the Drupal directory. We're running composer install, just like during the build step. But then what this one also does is it imports all of those JSON files that define your users and content and whatnot back into your Drupal installation. So all the content that's been updated elsewhere gets imported in. Now you have it all on your local. Also, I've defined a Lando build command that when you type Lando build, it tells Tome via Drush to generate those static HTML files. So that's what I mentioned earlier. So rather than changing into the Drupal directory and then typing Drush Tome :static, you just type Lando build, and it just does. So now, how can you make that deployment easier? How can you get that HTML out, onto the web? You could just take that HTML directory that was generated and use FTP and upload it to a cheap cPanel hosting, and it'll work just fine. But if you want to do some fun automation, you're using GitHub or another, you can use GitLab or any of the big ones. A service called NETLIFY, which is pretty popular in the front end development, like the JavaScript, React, Gatsby, all that. They're using NETLIFY in all kinds of cool ways, but mainly because NETLIFY can build all of their assets and everything. Not as popular with Drupal because NETLIFY doesn't really work with PHP. But if all we're doing is publishing static HTML, you can tie in your GitHub, or like I said, any other service. You say, okay, this is the path to my repository. And I say my published directory is Drupal/HTML, and I give NETLIFY, I point my domain name at NETLIFY as the hosting provider, and what NETLIFY will do is just monitor the GitHub repository whenever there's a push to the main branch. It will just trigger an automatic deployment. It'll publish your latest HTML to their server, and it's just posted. It just works. And NetFly is also cool. It gives you the ability to like roll back and things like that. Unfortunately, it doesn't really do a whole lot for Drupal itself, but just getting the static HTML up. And it's also free if you, I believe it's if you don't use your domain, your own domain name, that they give you one. It's like netlify.site, like whatever your username, .netlify.site. And you can get it free, if you just want to put up a simple website or something, or just play with it, try it out. All right, and that's where my actual slides end. So the example I just posted, I just showed you there, and some other examples that I'm going to talk about here in a moment. Actually, the Tome one I didn't commit to GitHub yet, but it'll be up there. I'll do it right after this. But github.com/aaronfelity/lando-examples. That's a repo I started a little bit ago, and over the next week or two, I'm going to add a bunch of examples to that. So follow that, and be able to see some cool things you can do. And so now this is where I'm going to switch to just showing you around an actual Lando file that is currently in use on a project. Frederick might actually recognize some of this. So this is a complicated site. This one, we are using Drupal for content entry. Drupal is hosted on platform.sh. Drupal is then exposing an API that can be consumed by Gatsby. Gatsby then builds static HTML and the static assets that need to be published. And we are actually hosting, Gatsby now has their own cloud service, so they are actually going to be doing the hosting. But what they do is they run the builds of their Gatsby system. Everything basically grabs it, queries Drupal, gets all the data, fills in all of the Gatsby templates, and then uses that to generate all of your pages. And then they actually handle getting that published online. And in our case, we're using a CDN to actually do the hosting. Well, that's what you'll hit. So anyway, I'm just going to kind of go and get into this and talk about what it's doing and all the nitty gritty here. So by default, we've got a Drupal 8 recipe in Lando. We get all those default containers, default services. Since we're using platform.sh for the hosting, they use Nginx rather than Apache. So we're saying, okay, Lando gives us this via, we get Nginx. So now the local is the same as what platform's doing. We could actually go into more detail here and say, I want a certain version. Got my web root. Okay, that's where Drupal lives. PHP, we're locking in at 7.3 here. Database, we're matching what our platform.sh environment has, which is MariaDB 10.2.
Quick question, Aaron, before you get
Sure.
further. Can you just quickly go over why you typically put your Drupal stuff in a Drupal folder in addition to the web root? I know a lot of kind of tutorials, examples just have web. Maybe just quickly just talk about that for a second, especially given the folders you have side by side.
Right. So in this particular environment, we are running, as I mentioned, Drupal, Gatsby, and some other systems. And so what we've done, referred to as a mono repo. So what we've done here is our different systems, rather than having different repositories, they all live in one repository. And so that Drupal directory is going to have our Drupal install. There's also a Gatsby directory that has all the Gatsby stuff installed there. So it's just kind of a way to kind of isolate these things. In my previous example, it actually, you wouldn't have needed the Drupal directory. You could actually just have installed Drupal in the root and just updated your web root. But because you have the option of generating static HTML, you might want to make it, I'm talking about the previous example now, you might want to make it so that the root of your repository has a Drupal directory and an HTML directory, for example, and you could have Drupal and everything that relates to that in that Drupal directory. And then as you generate your static HTML, you could have it in that HTML directory at the root, just kind of separate things. It's mainly like a preference thing. Less clutter, I'd say. But yeah, in my example here, everything is in separate directories, each different tool. And Lando can handle that. We can have Drupal and Gatsby, and we have another tool called Storybook that is for front-end development that also has its own place in the repository, and it's just all separated out there. And Lando is aware of all of them and how to run all of them. And that's kind of what I'll get into here. So services, that Drupal 8 recipe gave us the app server by default again. When it builds for the first time, this is actually a fun little trick I figured out here. So one of the things when we were working with Lando, If you're working on a team or if you're working on multiple machines and you update your Lando config in some way, unless you've told your coworkers about it or you remember to do it yourself if you're just switching machines, when you pull in the latest version of a Lando config file, you need to run a Lando rebuild, the Lando rebuild command, to actually get those updates installed into the environment. So I've got a little trick here to essentially remind you to do that. So what it does is it just takes a checksum of this file, stores it inside the Lando environment, this file that we're looking at, stores the hash, and then later, it's actually going to be at the bottom. Yeah, so Lando gives you the ability to have events, which are like sort of like hooks into the different processes that Lando is running. So when you run Lando start, which starts up your environment, we essentially hooked into that process here and said, okay, also run this command. And what I'm doing here is I'm just checking that hash and see if it still matches the Lando YAML file. And if it's changed, you get, it yells at you. And most of this is all just to make it colorful, get a bright red message. And I believe this is on my examples repo. But this we're running post start. So right after you run start, right after you run our Lando install tooling command, we also use a db reset command. So commands that are run frequently by anyone working on this project, we're checking the hash then. And if it's changed, it'll alert them, hey, you need to rebuild because you're not running the latest environment. Okay, and so we're using platform.sh. So what we want to do is we want the ability to interact with their systems using a CLI tool that they offer. And this is the first time that you build your environment. It pulls in, downloads that tool, installs it, makes it available to your project, to your environment. And we actually make use of that later. I'll show you. And then just like previous examples, we then just run a composer install on Drupal. And that's not really relevant. And so overrides, we're adding some environment variables that the different tools need. Again, for Drush, platform needs to know which project ID you're using. And then we're also using something I'll show you called the Drupal test traits for automated testing. And these are some of the environment variables needed for that. So now I've added a Node.js container here at service. This would not be in there by default with the Drupal recipe, but because we want to run Gatsby as well, which runs on Node, not PHP, you need to set up the environment to be able to handle that as well. So here we've said, okay, we've got a Node 10 service. Lando, those of you who've used Lando will know that it checks your URLs to make sure they're up and running after you start up Lando. It'll give you the URLs that to your website that you can use to access it, and it'll light them up green if it's able to. I believe it just pings them if it gets a successful response. And you turns green, but Gatsby doesn't actually host your site. So scanner false tells Lando to not sit there and keep trying to ping your site on that container, and it'll never get a positive response, but it'll keep trying, thinking maybe the services are just taking a while startup. So that speeds up your boot time in that event. And here, so the Node 10 type has some defaults, and so we've got some overrides here. We are saying that, so Gatsby hosts some development tools. Well, actually, just one tool is port 8000. And the other tool I mentioned, Storybook, for some front-end development things, they host on port 6006. So what we're doing here is telling Lando to expose port 8000 and port 6006 from inside this node service so that it's available on my local machine. So I can actually go to like localhost colon 8000 and I'll be able to access it. Otherwise, by default, Lando just tries to type port 80 inside the container. Since these tools are using different ports, you have to define those. And some more environment variables. Globals, this is a built-in feature of Lando that will tell it if you've got a node type service, which this one is, you get this globals option. And what that does is installs dependencies rather than putting them inside your project, makes them global to the whole environment or the whole node service. So this is installing the Gatsby CLI. Yarn, so we have those available. Build as root, that you can tell Lando to do things as the root user of the environment. Installing things that you might need sudo otherwise to do, essentially, is typically how you'd use that. In our case, we are telling the node user not to be assigned a default or to delete the default password. So when you spin up a Linux machine, the default users are going to get a username, and we've got some scripts that need to run. I said don't use a password. Otherwise, we'd have to encode the password directly into our script here, or get even more complicated. And it wasn't really necessary for something that's only going to run locally.
And real quick, before you get too far, did you ever run into that issue with the port conflicts when you set your ports up before, or did you ever see that?
Oh, okay. No.
Never mind then. I don't want to confuse the tutorial. I just want to know if you saw something and if you had a solution.
I'm out of time here. I'm running out, so I'll speed things up here. Again, we have the build step here, just running some commands similar to Composer. Node uses a tool called Yarn, essentially the same thing, gets all your dependencies. Just running those commands, build our storybook and our Gatsby environment. And then here's where, in this proxy, is where we tell Lando, hey, this is the URL I want to use. So when we're running Gatsby's development tool, for example, it by default gives you localhost colon 8000 as the URL you have to use to access it. And what we've done here is override it and say this URL is swdev.lando.site colon 8000 is inside the Node.js container. And when Lando gives you its list of URLs, it shows you this one. And actually, it's smart enough to just make this work. You don't need to have the colon 8000 anymore. You just go to this URL, and it'll automatically handle the routing for you, so that you can access it that way. And some tooling we use. So we've got all these extra services inside the container. So tooling, you type Lando develop, it tells it here, okay, inside the Node.js container or service, we need to run this yarn command that spins up the development environment. Makes it super easy. Otherwise, you have to type all of this out. every time you wanted to start that, and that's something that developers, when they're working on that, are going to do over and over again. So simple command. Build. This builds all of our static assets. Triggers Gatsby to run its build process. Triggers Storybook to run its build process. And generates all our static HTML for those things. Some more Drupal-y stuff here. So here I've defined platform, so you can type Lando platform, and it'll actually forward that to the platform sh CLI, so you can run commands that essentially execute on their servers. So you just type Lando platform, and it runs that. And we use that in another tooling here. So Lando DBDL, what that does is it uses the platform CLI and executes their db dump command with all the flags that go with it. Tells it to dump it into an SQL file on our local. And so we just type dbdl, and you just have the local database on your local machine. Then we added a db reset command. A little more complicated here. This tooling says, okay, so we have a database service that houses our database, MariaDB, and this says basically go into that system, run this import script, and this is searching for common zip files. So if it finds a zip file downloaded to our local, it will import it into our database. So you could actually probably compress this into a single command. But I wanted it to be separate because there are times where you want to reset the database to the state it was last downloaded in. So you type Lando DBDL, it just pulls in the latest database from platform, Lando DB reset, imports it, then runs all of your common updates your database, cache rebuild. You're doing config management, this will import the latest config, cache rebuild again. There's some quirks with that process, so having an extra cache rebuild kind of avoids those problems. And then it prompts you, it uses Drush's user login, and because we have the that environment variable set earlier, we get the full login URL to our Lando site for an admin login. Talk about, I think I promised to talk about some CI stuff. So here, so Lando gives you all these services. You can say, okay, I've got a node, find it. The node, it's type node. This is a pre-built setup made by the Lando team. Gives you the same defaults. But maybe you want to use something that isn't from the Lando team. They also give you the option to use your own Docker containers that you've made yourself or found elsewhere. In our example here, we've got, we're setting up a service called Chrome. We're saying we're using Docker Compose. So you're using Docker Compose syntax here now. This is the image we're downloading. In this case, it's a Chrome headless. So Chrome headless is for automated testing. Well, testing from command line essentially. There's no UI. You can't see the web page, but you can execute commands against the website with the Chrome headless. And so we're pulling that into Lando. We're telling it how it's supposed to access that, what ports it can be accessed on, and then the username to execute commands as. And the way we use that Scroll back down here. Test. So Drupal test traits, it allows you to run PHP unit tests using, typically when you run Drupal PHP unit tests, it starts with an empty database, and you're running tests. You have to, if you want to test some content, you have to create the content as part of your test and then do your tests against that. Drupal test traits allows you to actually import your current database and test content that you already have, which is useful if you are trying to just make sure things that you already have are continuing to work. So what we do here is I've got this first part is just telling you, I'll put some message with some colors. And then goes into the Drupal, runs PHP unit, and we've defined actually a PHP unit XML that tells PHP unit that, hey, you can access Chrome at that port we defined earlier, and then Lando will handle routing PHP units requests into the Chrome headless environment. So actually, without it ever doing anything visually, it actually loads your website and tests it. Reading the chat here, see if there's anything I need to respond to. So presentation mode here. So one of the things we do is we use GitHub Actions. So GitHub gives you, if you're not familiar with GitHub Actions, it came out sometime last year. At least they started getting pretty useful last year. So let me get back in the presentation. So this is a config file that's specifically for GitHub. You can tell it's okay. You want it to just run some CI type actions during certain events. In our case here, we're saying, okay, on a pull request, when GitHub receives, when you create a pull request on GitHub, it's going to then execute this process. And what we've done here is we've told it, we've defined this as tests in Lando. So what we're doing here is we're telling GitHub about the type of environment essentially that Lando needs to run in. And then we're using Hyperdrive. Hyperdrive is available on Lando's GitHub. It's one of the other projects. Let's see, github.com/Lando/Hyperdrive. And we're saying, okay, download Hyperdrive, install Hyperdrive, check out the master branch of our project, and then we're just running. We're installing. Okay, we're checking it out. We're defining here. Then we're just basically just running Lando. So just like we would on our local machine, we say Lando start. -v just gives you the verbose output of what Lando's doing. So when you go back and look at the logs, if something failed, you can see where. And then we're authenticating with platform.sh, and we're dumping the database from platform. So we're pulling that into GitHub, not to be stored as code, just to run as part of our testing process. And actually, this is inside our Lando environment now. So just like the commands we use locally, these just are running now as essentially a script that GitHub's running for us. Does our database stuff, imports everything, And then the very last step is it runs that Lando test that I just showed you, that kicks off that testing process. So what you've done here is you have the exact same environment running that you're working on all day, every day, running in your automated tests. And what this does is if you have, in the case of GitHub, you can add, you can do things like make it so that your tests, if they fail, you can't merge that code in. You automate things a bit, check for things that, maybe you didn't realize you broke, and then this will tell you broke it before you merge it. So that's super useful. And I think that's going to be where I'm going to cut it off. I have time. I could talk about this for hours. So, yeah. So I guess if anyone has any questions, kind of a small window here for this. So if somebody could, if there's anything in the chat that someone could read to me, that'd be helpful.
Maybe just quickly talk about the Xdebug on and off. I mean, that's like the most powerful thing, especially if you're going to do with hosting and knowing your hosts between Apache and Nginx. Just making sure you set up the right way.
Yeah, and that's actually something I plan to add into that examples repository. Is the two different versions. I'm gonna see if I can figure out a way to make it decide for itself and do it automatically. But yeah, so one of the things he's mentioning here is the, let's see, how do I get? I'm not used to working in this presentation mode. They get rid of everything. So back in our Lando file, Xdebug on, Xdebug off. So Xdebug is super useful for debugging PHP code. It allows you to essentially walk through your code while it's running, and gives you a bunch of information about the state of your variables and such as you're stepping through. So super useful. Lando's Drupal 8 recipe and many of the PHP-based recipes have Xdebug on by default. Well, they allow you to turn it on. So when you turn it on, it's always on. And when you're adding in all this debug info and processing on the server, you actually slow down your site quite a bit. So we're kind of going beyond Lando's built-in functionality where it's just always on or always off for your environment. Give you a command. So you type Lando Xdebug on, and it executes the command necessary to enable Xdebug inside the Docker service. Then Xdebug off. So turn it on when you're using it. It'll slow things down some, but you get all the benefit. And then when you're not using it, and turn it off, and you get all your speed back. And if, depending on what you're running, what he said specifically, because we're running Nginx rather than Apache, the command is actually a little bit different. Configuration is different in those two environments for running Xdebug. So these commands are going to be a little bit different. Now I'll get those into my examples repository so you can compare those.
Yeah, another context I'd add is this is a lifesaver. I know a lot of people complain, well, oh, Lando, I don't like Lando, it's slow. Like the Xdebug default on is one of the reasons why. So the fact that you have these commands and you don't have to keep rebuilding Lando when you want to run Xdebug, turn it on and off, was definitely a godsend. So thanks.
Yeah, once I figured that out, that was a big improvement in performance.
All right. Have you submitted PRs to try and get these into the core Lando build?
It's actually this came from a Lando issue. Somebody posted the comment in there, and I forget why exactly. It's a while since I looked at it, but there was some quirk, some reason they didn't want to like merge it in this kind of change. They consider it, but there was some reason why, if I remember correctly, that they didn't want to do it, at least not yet. Maybe something else needed to be fixed first. That's all.
Cool.
All right, everybody. Now take yourself off mute if you would like to. Let's give Aaron a round of applause for the presentation.
Great job, dude.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Rounds of applause.
All right. And with that, we're going to end the recording.